Great. Okay, now can you hear me okay? Wonderful. Thank you.
So it is 4 o'clock. I just started the live stream, but I'm going to hang out just a couple more minutes to give that a chance to kick in and allow a few more people to arrive, and then we'll get started.
Sounds great.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started this afternoon. My name is Laurel Plimier, and welcome to our program this afternoon. Can you trust the polls? Be better informed about what the polls are and are not. So I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Piedmont, and League of Women Voters of Oakland is also co-sponsoring this event. And thank you all who are joining us for spending some time with us this afternoon. Before we get to the introduction of our speaker today, I just wanted to go over a couple of logistics. So if you're on the Zoom call with us, please remain muted for the duration of the event to minimize background noise. You can post questions for our speaker either now or anytime during the program, either in the Zoom chat if you're on the Zoom call with us, or in YouTube live stream comments, or you can send an email to lwvpiedmont@gmail.com, and I'll ask as many of them as we have time for. If you're joining us on YouTube, please feel free to subscribe, and you can click the little bell to get notifications of future live streams. To get advance notice of future events, you can join our mailing list, which you can do on our website, www.lwvpiedmont.org. And you can also join the League there, and your membership supports our efforts in voter education and advocacy, which is important work for now and the foreseeable future. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Jennifer Trainer, who's one of our program committee chairs, and she will introduce our program.
Jennifer, you're on mute.
Apologies. Can you hear me now? Great, thank you. I'm really delighted today to welcome Amy Simon, who is a founding partner of Goodwin Simon Strategic Research. Amy has 3 decades of experience as a pollster and political strategist. She's had clients in many different fields, including state and local government, labor unions, nonprofits, foundations, and political and candidate committees. One of the most unique aspects of her background stems from her earlier work as a community and field organizer. So she's been at the ground level and really understands what goes into a very granular process from the bottom up. She was one of the leading architects of the pro-marriage messaging in Washington State and in Maine, and her deep knowledge of important political issues spans the spectrum, including abortion, climate change, gun responsibility, and many, many more issues. Thank you, Amy, for joining us today and enlightening us about how polls are constructed and how credible they are. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer. I really appreciate that, and appreciate everybody taking an interest in polling. For some people, it's kind of an esoteric issue, so it's great to see people engaged, interested to find out more. I know we want to make sure we have time for questions, so I'll spend some time doing kind of an overview and talking about some of the groundwork for our discussions later, but I want to make sure that we save time for Q&A as well. So I'm going to start by saying that polling is a science and an art. And they're both combined, and maybe there's a little bit of magic fairy dust in there too. But the core principle of polling is that when you have a randomly selected and representative sample of the population whose opinions you want to measure, then the responses to your survey will accurately represent the views of that population as a whole. That's a lot. There's a lot to unpack there. And some of the things that are really important to keep in mind are that your sample, the people you're talking to, they have to be randomly selected, because if they're not randomly selected, then they won't be representative. They also have to be representative. And so there are things that can interfere with whether or not they're representative of the population as a whole. And then furthermore, we have to define who is the population we're trying to measure. So for an election, we're trying to survey likely voters, and that is the population we're trying to measure. But that's not a fixed thing. We can't just look at the census data to figure out who likely voters are. So many adults in the US are not eligible to vote. Other adults are eligible, but they're not registered. And others are registered, but they don't vote. And non-voters obviously don't have a say in the election outcome. So as pollsters, we want to exclude them from our polling samples. So how do we make sure that we're including likely voters and screening out non-voters anytime we're conducting a survey? An election pollster has to make many judgments about the composition of the likely electorate. Who do they think is going to show up and vote in any given election? That's what we call our turnout model. So every pollster makes their own turnout model. I'll talk a little bit more about that. So turnout model means literally like how many men, how many women, how many white men, how many white women, how many black men, how many black women, how many Hispanic people, what ages do we expect? Do we expect there to be more young people voting than usual or less young people voting than usual? Do we expect seniors to have a higher turnout for some reason? How many people do we expect to have a college degree or not have a college degree in the electorate? And we have to build that turnout model and say, what do we think the composition of the electorate is likely to be? And small changes in the electorate and the composition of the electorate can have huge electoral impacts. So in 1992, for example, was the year of the woman, and women were elected to the US Senate and the US House in large numbers. And in fact, women voters turned out a slightly higher portion. They were 53% of the electorate. Typically, they were about 52%. And that small change was enough to lift in many different places to be the difference and lead to the year of the woman. 1994, if you remember, was Contract with America, Newt Gingrich, total shock to many people, including some of the pollsters, because the polling early on, what happened is that pollsters kept getting polls that had women as 50% of the electorate, and typically they're 52, maybe as much as 52.5%. So what happened as pollsters saw these numbers coming in, is they said, oh, we must just not have enough women in our sample because of these issues about who we contact and how we contact them. We're going to weight up women to 52% of the electorate. And the polls then failed to predict the kind of sweeps that happened, for example, in Washington State, which had just elected Patty Murray, the mom in tennis shoes, as a senator the following election year in that midterm election. Women stayed home, and there was this sweep that wiped out many of the Democrats, including the Speaker at the time, Tom Foley. So it sounds like a small amount, 50 to 53%. Why would that have such a big impact on the outcome? But it does. So pollsters make these determinations about our turnout models using science. We look at, for example, voter registration numbers, and we look at the current polls, and we're constantly getting updates on exactly who's registered to vote. We're looking at the demographic data that's available to us on the voter registration polls, so we can see people's gender, their age, if it's a state with party registration, we're looking at the party registration data to see how many people there are registered as Democrats, Independents, Republicans, third party. So that's the current data we're looking at. We're also looking at voter turnout patterns in the past similar elections. So we're looking at, in this case, prior presidential elections, and looking at, we use exit polls from previous elections. They're really valuable tools for us to help us know, well, how well did our models hold up in the last few elections? What might we need to adjust them? And then what are some of the things that are happening now in the present that might impact voter turnout? And sometimes pollsters overestimate the impact of things, and sometimes they underestimate them. In one year in Georgia, not too long ago, there was a ballot measure on the Confederate flag, and it drove up voter turnout among white people in rural areas in the state. And so the pollsters who were doing polling relying on previous election results in terms of the composition of the electorate underestimated that vote. And in fact, Republicans did much better as a result than expected, and the polls appeared to be off. So those are all kinds of things that are moving into the art and how the art and the science intersect. Exit polls are a really important tool, and it's very important for us that they be conducted well, because they give us insight after the fact into how our models might have been accurate or underestimated or overestimated different kinds of trends. So one of the things that we know from the 2016 election is that a lot of pollsters made errors in not including enough non-college educated white people in their polls. So they overestimated in their polls how many people would have a college degree. They underestimated it, how many people would not have a college degree for white people. I'll talk a little bit more about that in weighting in a few moments to how we deal with that. So pollsters also have to consider our sample. How are we going to, which lists are we going to use to reach voters? So the gold standard used to be that you would use random digit dialing. You would get a list of phone numbers that was randomly generated by a computer. So it had every possible phone number. It didn't matter if you were unlisted or listed. It didn't matter if you had just turned on your phone the day before or lived there for 40 years. We could have an equal chance of reaching you. And random digit dialing still happens and is still a model that people use. Now it includes both cell phones and landlines as well. In the old days, when I was first polling, we only used landline samples. But when you use RDD, random digit dialing, what that means is that you don't know if the people you're reaching are actually registered to vote. You have to rely on their self-report. And so sometimes people will think that they're registered to vote, but actually they're not, or their registration expired, or they moved and they didn't change it and update it. And so there's this risk in there. On the one hand, you're including everybody that should be there, but you might be over-including people who actually aren't eligible to vote, even though they think that they are. So you have to balance these things when you're making a decision about how to conduct your poll. Another option that pollsters use are voter registration lists. So all the voter registration lists in the country are available to pollsters, and we can match phone numbers to them. So we can call those people on those lists. That way we know that everybody we're reaching is actually a registered voter and is actually eligible to vote. But there are some numbers that are not available through matching. So there might be about 15% of that list where we actually can't find a public phone number for that person. And so we know that there's kind of a hole there. So these are trade-offs that pollsters are having to make all the time. Another consideration is the mode that you're using. Are you calling people on a telephone, which means nowadays that we have to call both cell and landline samples, and we have to combine the results for those, which can add some error. Or do we want to do an online survey? And so online surveys are more and more popular and more common. They're much less expensive to administer. And so a lot of news organizations have moved to online surveys, but there is some bias in them because people who are online tend to be younger. They tend to be somewhat more educated. On the other hand, when we do phone surveys, we tend to be missing out on younger people. And so in the last few election cycles, a lot of pollsters have started to add in a texting option where you text young people an invitation to take the survey, to call back an 800 number and take the survey, or ask them if they'd be willing to answer the phone if you called, because we have to increase their participation in phone surveys. So there's a lot of mechanical aspects about how we contact people that are really important. And that comes back to that question of making sure that the people we're talking to in the poll sample are representative of the population as a whole. So to make sure we're talking to likely voters, we also have to design screening questions. that determine in our minds whether the person is a likely voter or whether they should be terminated from the interview after answering some of the screening questions. And these screening questions vary quite a bit between pollsters. Everybody has their own secret sauce, and most pollsters don't want to reveal their screening questions because it's part of what makes them effective as pollsters for the ones who do it well. So typical questions are things like, how likely are you to vote this year? Are you definitely going to vote, probably going to vote? Are the chances 50-50? Will you probably not vote, or will you definitely not vote? And so if someone says they're definitely not going to vote, you terminate them. We ask people things like, well, are you planning to vote in person? Are you planning to vote by mail? Are you planning to vote in person but early, or are you unsure? If they have a plan for how they're likely to vote, then that is a better sign than if they say, well, gee, I don't know, I haven't really thought about it yet. We ask things like, how interested are you in the election? How closely are you following it? Oftentimes there'll be a scale, like a 1 to 10 scale or 0 to 10 scale about their interest, and then pollsters are making determinations about including people above a certain level of interest in their sample and excluding others. So they ask this package of questions and then look at their expected turnout model and decide who they want to include or exclude from their poll based on their responses to these questions. So when we are looking at the poll sample after the poll is completed and we have our 1,000 interviews or 1,200 interviews, then we're looking to see, does it really match my expected composition of the electorate? And oftentimes it doesn't. And so we may say, oh, you know what, there's not enough non-college white men in here. I need to weight them up. And so that means we literally, instead of a person counting for one response, that person now might count for 1.05 people. And so people who are overrepresented in the poll, we weight them down, and people who are underrepresented, we weight them up. Weighting has to be done very carefully and very thoughtfully because it can introduce more error in it inadvertently if you don't do it carefully. So one example of that, which you may have heard something about if you've been following any of the pollster, I'm going to call it through pollster gossip this election cycle, is about this question of whether there are enough non-college white people, in particular non-college white men, included in surveys. They are somewhat harder to reach, as are young Hispanic men. And so you have to do extra work to reach them. And some pollsters may be aware of weighting by education, meaning that they increased the weight that non-college people in their poll had. But actually, there's very few notable differences in terms of voting patterns among Hispanics or among Black people based on education level. So if you just weight up non-college people, you're actually also weighting up Black people and Hispanic people because 19% of Hispanics in the US have a college degree, 26% of Black people have a college degree, but 40% of white people have a college degree. So when you're doing this weighting, you actually need to do a much more targeted weighting where you need to actually weight up non-college white men specifically, not just non-college people generally. So those are some of the kinds of considerations that you need to basically take into account. How do you tell if a poll is a good poll in this time and day? So there's a really wonderful poll site called 538.com. If you guys aren't familiar with it, you should definitely go check it out. Nate Silver has been really thoughtful about how he has built their approach. They're an aggregator of polls. So they look at all these different polls that are publicly available. They put them together. They're looking at polls for congressional races, Senate races, governor's races, and the presidential race. They also rate individual pollsters based on their track record. So if you're wondering, if you see one single poll that came out, you're like, wow, is that a good poll or not? How do I know? The first thing you could do is just go to the website and see, does that pollster get an A rating or do they get a C? There are some pollsters that are really inconsistent, that their polls don't typically reflect on a consistent way what actually happens in the election. And so that's one good place to go. So in addition to that, the aggregated polling data just really gives you a much stronger sense of where things are rather than relying on any individual poll. Each individual poll can have its own sources of error, but when you look at 20 polls combined and you average them, that's likely to be really close to what's actually really happening out there. So I do encourage you to take a look at that and consider that. In terms of this current election and what's happening and the polls right now, one thing to keep in mind with the presidential election that is really important is that national polls are really much less valuable than state-specific polls, because there is a very large portion of people. So for example, in California, there is a 32-point lead between Biden over Trump. And in New York State and Massachusetts, a lot of these states, the gap is so large that Biden could have a 5-point lead in national polls, but Trump could still win the Electoral College. And so if you really want to understand what's happening in the presidential election, the national polls are a good barometer. Right now, the average, Biden's lead over Trump has been hovering about between 7 and 9 points throughout the summer, going up and down. It's about 7 points right now. But it won't be surprising if it tightens. That often happens as people's sort of base each comes home to them. But looking at the individual state level polls is going to be a much more important and accurate way to see what's happening. In the battleground polls, so there's some pollsters that do polls of just the swing states, just the battleground states. And in those battleground states, Biden's lead is closer to 4 to 5%, which means that it's hovering right around the place where he is in the lead clearly, but it's not a huge lead, and certainly not as big as that national lead of 7 points. So what's happening right now with polling? So one of the things to realize is that in 2016, there was less partisanship than there is now. I know that sounds crazy because things were already polarized and partisan at the time, but it's actually gotten worse and more intense in terms of that polarization. So the percentage of people who might change their minds and who say they might change their minds is lower now than it was in 2016. So there's less fluidity in the race. There's fewer undecideds and less fluidity. But another important thing to realize about polling and is that a poll is always a snapshot in time. It is accurate if it's well done for that moment in time, but it's not a crystal ball and it doesn't predict the future. And so it's important to realize sometimes when journalists are writing about polls and saying that a poll was wrong, it's not actually fair to say that, because the poll might have been taken 10 days before the election in a close race, and then lots of things happen in the last 10 days that impact the outcome. And some people changed their minds and some people made up their minds. And so the final outcome on election day doesn't match what the poll said 10 days before because things actually changed. And so that's another important thing to remember as well. Campaigns spend hundreds of millions of dollars on late advertising, and they do it because it does have an impact. There are also late emerging events. Some of you may remember Comey's letter late in 2016, and that had a clear negative impact and support for Hillary Clinton at the time. And in addition to all of the money they're spending on advertising, campaigns are investing huge amounts of money in get out the vote efforts and targeted get out the votes efforts. And so if they do their job really well, they can actually change the composition of the electorate. And they do oftentimes in very closely contested races. So even if you have the best turnout model ever, and it would have been accurate, with really targeted turnout efforts, you can actually drive more people of a certain kind to the polls. And then again, the poll didn't capture that in advance because they didn't anticipate the particular kind of GOTV effort. So, and when you're looking at polls, another thing to look at is the size of the poll sample. So every poll has a margin of error. And when a poll is just, like when you have a poll of just 400 people, your margin of error is about plus or minus 5 points. If you go up to 1,200 people, it's going to be just plus or minus 3 points. So what does the margin of error actually mean? It means that if a survey result shows that Biden is at 50% support, and it's a 1,200 person sample, that means that it's bounded by 3 points on either end. So actually his support could really be as low as 47, or it could be as high as 53. So it's actually defining the range of where things are. And journalists write this and they include it as a little footnote when they write up polling articles, but people have a hard time wrapping their head. They want to stick with that one number. So they think it's 50%, but it's really saying the number is somewhere between 47 and 53. So obviously in an election, that's a pretty wide range that it could be within in reality. So in general, when you're looking for polls, for poll quality, a larger sample from a more highly rated pollster is going to be more reliable than either a less well-rated pollster or a smaller sample size. So I'm going to just pause there and see if there are questions that people want to start asking.
Thank you, Amy. We do have a number of questions already. The first question is sort of like laying the ground for polls in general. Why do we need polls? And well, let's start with that, and then I have a follow-up question too.
Okay, that's a great question. Why do we need polls? And I believe, and I think a lot of people believe, that you need polls because you do need to understand how people feel about a wide range of things, and not just about candidates, but about so many issues. You need to have a pulse on the country, on the state, on your community, because you're better able to make good decisions about governing if you understand how people feel about things. So to me, a core part of democracy and a functioning democracy is actually knowing how people feel. And related to why do you need to have polls, you need to have racially diverse and both men and women as pollsters, because pollsters can only, voters can only answer the questions that we ask them. And if we only have sort of white male pollsters, then the kinds of questions that get written are often limited, or they're not asked in quite the right way, and they don't make sense to other people who have different life experiences and different cultural backgrounds. So it's important to have really wide mix of people as pollsters and in the industry to make sure that we're asking the right questions in the right ways that really represent people's experiences and can capture those range of experiences.
So that has to do with sort of giving feedback to government officials, right? Like polling the community, what is the community interested in? What about polls, like polls for Biden versus Trump, and of course, Clinton versus Trump in 2016? How is it useful to give the public that prediction of a possible future? And especially given how clearly inaccurate they can be, which we all have experienced.
Yes, I think it's helpful for people to know, because it makes to know what the possibilities are and to know what the possible outcomes are. It helps them make decisions about themselves as individuals. So if you really care about a race or an outcome and you find out that it's close, you're going to be more motivated to go vote yourself. You're going to be more motivated to give money to the candidates that might need it. You might be more motivated to volunteer to do voter turnout efforts or do voter persuasion efforts. So your ability to decide how you spend your time and how you want to be impactful, you can do many different things as a volunteer, right? You could work at a food bank. You could be, raising money for the League of Women Voters. You could be spending your time doing Get Out the Vote. How are you going to spend your time? Well, if you know that a race is a close race, you're going to make a really different decision about that than if you know that it's a blowout and your participating is not going to have any particular impact on that.
So you mentioned that the polls take a snapshot in time. I have a couple of questions surrounding that. The first is when you conduct the polls that are taking that snapshot, how long is it before you then turn around that information and give it to the public?
So pollsters in this current environment do it really fast. So they might do a poll over the course of 3 or 4 nights and then turn around the data within 2 days after the poll is completed. And they disclose the dates of the fielding. So we call them the fielding dates. So they'll say, and when it's publicly released and written up in the newspaper, they'll say exactly which dates they were doing the interviewing. They'll say whether it was online or telephone. And they will also say the sample size and margin of error and any other kind of qualifications about the methodology that they employed, including whether they weighted the data or not. So all that information is available. And their intention is to turn things around very quickly, because these days polling data gets stale very fast because something can just happen. And, there was all this polling happening and then over the summer, and then, things happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and there was a lot of questions about how is the news coverage of what's happening there going to impact voters. So then pollsters want to get right into the field, measure attitudes around that, as well as asking the presidential and turnaround data. There are pollsters right now who are in the field polling about, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death and the Supreme Court and how that's going to be impacting things. And they're going to want that data to be available, by mid to late next week at the latest, just to be able to be timely.
So the follow-up question is how, given that this election, a lot of people are being advised to vote early, a lot of local polling sites are open early when they haven't historically been, and a lot of people I know are going to be returning mail-in voted ballots early. How does that affect the influence that the polls might have on those voters?
So I don't know how much, we don't know how much polling itself influences voters. But the challenge for us as pollsters is that we have to make sure that once voting starts, we have to make sure that we are asking voters about whether they have voted already or whether they intend to vote or whether they're not going to vote. So our screening questions have to change. The closer we get to the election, the more people who have cast a ballot, we actually have to adjust our screening questions and potentially adjust our turnout models, because we can track how many people have sent we're able to track every day how many people have sent in their ballots and which kind of people. So we can see, I'm sure you've seen some reports already that in a lot of key swing states, the number of Democrats that have requested absentee ballots is greater than the number of Republicans that have requested absentee ballots. So that's an early indication to us that there may be a bit of a Democratic surge. Other polling is showing that more Republicans plan to vote on election day than Democrats. More Democrats plan to vote by mail. And so the fact of that imbalance right now is not in and of itself determinative if that's just going to be a larger trend that will hold the entire time, that just in the end, more Democrats cast their ballots by mail and more Republicans cast their ballots in person. But we're looking at all those things so we can make adjustments to our turnout models if needed based on how those things are going.
The sun has come in your window and there's a huge ray
Sorry,
of sun.
I see that. Okay,
there, that's
there
much
we go.
better. That's much better.
Okay.
So when you talk about the exit polls, how do you determine who you're going to ask, and how do you assess whether or not the answers that you get to exit polls are truthful, and then maybe tie that in also to what we were just talking about with the early voting and how that's all going to work?
Yeah, so we don't do exit polling. Exit polling is incredibly expensive and time-consuming and difficult. And so there is a pooled exit poll. There's one national exit poll, and all the different major news organizations essentially buy into it and fund it jointly. And so they have a whole bunch of pollsters who work together, design all of those kinds of questions. So they do polls of people who have voted absentee and voted early to find out how they feel, and they combine those with the actual exit day polls on election day. I'm sure they're making a ton of adjustments this year because of COVID to their model for exit polling compared to previous years. And I don't know all of the different ways that they are going to be making those changes, but it will be a really challenging year for exit polling as well. But what they do in a typical election year when there's not COVID is they choose different polling locations across the country. They basically randomly sample polling locations just like we randomly sample individuals. They have people who are there as interviewers, and they are required to have some kind of a metric so that they're not just walking up to people who are more friendly or something like that, who look more friendly. So they're required to ask, for example, every fifth person who comes out, they count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then they go to the fifth person, they interview them, and then they wait for the next fifth person. So they have a way to make sure that the choosing of who their interview there is randomized.
For the RDD, random dialing.
Random digit dial.
Random digit dialing, yes. So it seems to me that that is making an assumption that certain people are answering the calls, and obviously certain people will not be answering the calls, so that no matter how random you are, and even if you text younger voters ahead of time, you're still only getting polling results from people who have decided that they want to answer. And I'm wondering if there have ever been studies on the differences between that type of person versus the person who would never answer your phone, even if you texted them in advance, and how that affects the results.
There have been many, probably thousands of studies on this question of how are people who respond different from people who don't respond. And there's quite a bit of variation in it, and it varies a lot by topic. So there's some topics where there's very large differences, and some topics where there's fewer differences. But what's been happening over time with the increase of cell phones. So in 1997, I mentioned was like the golden age of polling. We had 97% of US households had a landline. And so we could really draw an incredibly accurate sample when we used RDD. Now, by 2003, 3% of households had cell phones only. So we were down to 94% coverage, and then it just exponentially increased. So by 2013, we had almost 50% of households that were either cell phone only or cell phone mostly, and our sampling had to completely change every year to accommodate that shift, those changes that were happening on the ground. Now, a lot of pollsters have moved to online polling, in part because there has been a decrease in cooperation rates on the phone. And they worry that even though in earlier years, you could make up the difference through waiting, that the non-cooperation rates are so high now that you can't actually get an accurate sample via telephone. So there's a lot of robust debates about that, and pluses and minuses about whether you decide to do an online poll or a telephone poll. For the most part, when phone polls are done well, constructed well, they are still accurate now. That may not be true in 5 years, but right now it still is.
So you talked about the importance of state polls versus a national polling. What is your take on how, whether there are some states who don't poll as much as other states, and so does that influence the national view of what the Electoral College would end up being?
Yeah, so it's the news organizations and outside entities and organizations like, Pew or, Kaiser Family Foundation or Gallup that are making decisions about whether to do national polls, state polls, or a mix. And in 2016, there was a heavy reliance on national polling. It's cheaper because you can just do one poll of 1,000 people across the whole country and get that snapshot, as opposed to going into 20 different battleground states and having to do 20 separate polls, which you can see there's a huge expense with that. Because of the polling failures in 2016, many of those organizations have decided to invest in doing state-specific polling. And so there's a lot more state-specific polling happening this year that is publicly available, that is good quality, and that's helping people to understand what's happening. There are some states that just get more of it than others. And so, there is just more polling happening in Pennsylvania and in Ohio and in Wisconsin compared to, for example, Minnesota. And that's just there's no coordinating body that says, okay, let's make sure every key state gets one poll a week so we can track what's happening there. Each individual entity is making its own decisions about where they want to poll. So some states do have more data available than others, and that can make things be a little bit of a mystery, more of a mystery than some people would like it to be in terms of what's happening in certain key states.
So when the results of a poll are given, they often, but not always, give the margin of error. How is that margin of error determined?
That's based on the number of interviews that are conducted relative to the population. So that it's a very simple formula. In fact, you could Google margin of error calculator, and you could see how it's done. It's very straightforward. A little like software will pop up that you could just pop your numbers right into.
So, sorry, I'm reading through I'm trying to listen and read through questions at the same time. So how concerned, there are a lot of questions, a number of different questions about accuracy, and how concerned are you about the accuracy for this election cycle?
So I feel much better about the accuracy for this election cycle. So there's two, here's why. Why do I feel better? Okay, so 2016 was a wake-up call to a lot of people in the industry about the way that they built their turnout models and about the way that they weighted their data. And so that most I would say every responsible pollster has made some changes to their own processes, their own screening, their own everything as a result of that, in particular to how they weight. So there is an awareness now. So in 2007, up through 2006, there was not a consistent difference in terms of how people who did not have a college degree who were white voted. They weren't more Democratic or more Republican. It really varied by candidate, varied by a lot of different things. Starting in 2007, and a lot of researchers think it has to do with increased sort of identity politics and racial alignment, white non-college voters started to move away from Democrats and more towards Republicans. And so that was a shift that was something that people were not necessarily accounting for enough in their polling. It was just starting to happen, although the polling for Obama was quite accurate and was a good predictor and in terms of the final outcome. By 2015, we started to see a shift again where college-educated whites started to split by party. And again, prior to that, there wasn't necessarily consistency in how they went. But now that same shift has happened where college-educated white voters are more likely to be Democratic than to be Republican. And so this means that the way that we weight had to change. And now pollsters are aware of it, and they are weighting, I think, much more appropriately in that sense. There's also, I think, not for every pollster, but and there is this intersection of cost and methodology where things that you need to do polling well are expensive, and then news organizations that have been losing money over time are less likely to invest into like really high quality polling, and that can create a challenge too. So there are bad polls out there, and it's one of the reasons that I think the 538 website is so good, because you can see who the good and not so good pollsters are. But for example, if you are polling in a state that has a large Hispanic population, you really have to build your composition carefully in particular ways, and also you have to do your interviews in Spanish as well as in English. And some pollsters who are not as high quality, they're not going to pay for the cost of translation to Spanish for Spanish language interviewing, and what they will do is just weight up the English speaking Hispanics, but they're not the same. Their attitudes are not the same. Their voting is not the same. And so that kind of weighting is like cheap and sloppy. So polling in like Florida, in Arizona, in Nevada, in states that have significant Hispanic populations, you really want to make sure that you're looking at a quality poll because they've had to invest extra time and cost into making sure that they're accurately representing Hispanic voters in those states. Why else am I more confident? Okay, weighting is better. People are more aware of some of the different population, subgroup population trends that need to be accounted for. This isn't about polling being better, but the attitudes are more fixed. There's less fluidity. And that's just people are digging into their side. So it seems less likely that there's going to be some seismic shift in how people vote just because things are so sort of more firmly entrenched compared to other years. So that would be another reason. Now, a concern I have that's not related to the polling, but does impact its usefulness as a predictor is voter suppression and efforts to steal the election and to prevent people from voting. So when you look at the polls from 2000 election for president in Florida, the polls accurately predicted that Gore won the state. But what happened is that there was a problem with those ballots in Palm Beach County, and you had all of those people inadvertently voting for somebody they did not mean to vote for with that butterfly ballot, and so he lost the state and therefore the presidential election. And it wasn't because the polls were inaccurate, because people intended to vote a certain way, but they were prevented from doing that. And you also have voter intimidation efforts and voter suppression efforts that can prevent people who do intend to vote and have a certain vote from being able to cast their vote accurately or cast it at all. So those are some concerns that I have.
So you touched on it a little bit. I don't know if you're familiar with Rachel Bykofer, who does election modeling prediction. And she predicted the 2018 midterm elections, and her model was based on turnout versus swing voters, which was sort of a new thing. And I'm wondering how whether you're taking turnout, how you can take turnout into account when you're doing the polling, and then how your work relates to the election modeling, which seems to be a different body of work around elections and election predicting, results predicting.
Yeah, so so turnout, not only the composition of the electorate, but the total number of people in the electorate is absolutely a core part of polling, and that's something that pollsters have to consider when they're creating their voter turnout models and the models that they're using for their own screening to design their own polls. So, for example, in 2018, there was record high turnout for a mid-year election. Typically in mid-year elections, about 38% of eligible voters go to vote. And in 2018, 50% of eligible voters went out to vote, which is a huge increase. And that is probably, in general, the 2018 polling was very accurate. There were some places where it was not. And in some of those places, it looks like the composition of the electorate was really off from prior elections. And that's part of what led to the polls not being correct, because they weren't capturing the actual mix of people who were going to be voting. But the pollsters are anticipating high voter turnout this year. And based on both 2018 and also based on just a high level of interest. For example, the Wall Street Journal NBC poll just came out today, and they had a record high proportion of people who said that they are very interested in the election on a 0 to 10 scale. I think 75% chose 10 as most interested, and then another small portion chose a 9. So it's a high in terms of like interest in the election, and that level of interest is, we know, tied to voter turnout. So we do expect turnout to be high. So you also asked about models. So we have voter turnout models, which are what each individual pollster is working with. But the 538, Nate Silver, and some other folks, they build models about what they expect to be the likely turnout, the likely outcome of an election. And so that is a different complicated thing. It's sort of like if you heard anything about the modeling they've been doing around how many COVID deaths will happen. That is a science we put a lot of inputs in. So they're looking at past presidential election results. They're looking at what the economic circumstances were in prior years, election years. They're looking at what the outcome was when there was an incumbent versus a challenger. They're looking at all of these different factors, economic crises, other kinds of crises. The pandemic, the Nate Silver's model this year goes all the way back to 1918 to include the pandemic from the flu then, the Spanish flu. And so they're looking at all the factors to build a really robust sense of what are all the different things that might impact the outcome of the election, and trying to give each of them a probability weight. So right now, the 538 model is saying that there's about a 70%, but it's about 70-30 in terms of Biden compared to Trump. So there was also 70-30 in 2016. And at the time, people were critical of the 538 model because they were saying that it was giving Trump too much of a chance to win. And then, of course, he did win because 30% odds is still, that's still not zero. So it's a little bit, it just recently got updated. I think it's now about 75-25, something like that. But so the modeling is actually not looking, it's looking at a lot of other environmental factors in addition to polling data to make predictions.
When you're doing the calling of voters, what is the general percentage of calls that actually result in a complete survey? And do you have to get all of your answers, all of your questions answered in order to count that person in your poll?
Yes, we have to get all of the questions answered in order to count that person. We do track what we call mid-survey terminate. So we ask our demographic questions up front early. So we want to know your race, your party, your age, your gender, your ideology, so that if you drop off partway through, we're looking at what we call differential drop-off. So we want to know if the people who are stopping the survey partway through are more likely to be something. Are they more likely to be young conservatives? Or are they more likely to be older Democrats? Like, who are they? Because then that can impact our weighting. We want to weight them back in. So we're going to look for people who are like them, who did complete the survey, and weight them up a little bit more. So those are some of the ways that we consider that. In terms of the cooperation rates, now they're they're pretty low. I don't remember the exact level, but they're probably somewhere around 10 to 15%. And so we have to make a lot of calls to get a completed survey. We do have protocols that are really important for quality polling, where we call every single number 6 times over the course of 3 to 4 nights, because we don't only want to reach the people who answer the phone the first time. So we want to make sure that we're getting harder to reach populations as well. So we'll call people slightly different times of the day or night over a course of several days, and then before we sort of give up on them, essentially.
So you mentioned Nate Silver and 538. Are there other people who do sort of the aggregating of polls? I mean, is that the only website we can go to if we want to get information about what polls are out there and how to evaluate them?
I think it's generally the best one. There are definitely other models out there. If you're a gambling person, you can see what the odds are that either one will win, and you can place your money based on those odds. But I do think that the 538 site is the most robust for many, many reasons. So it is the one that I would recommend. And then you can go to individual polls, as well. There's so many different pollsters that are out there. And I see this note in the comments about the A+ pollsters. I wouldn't limit yourself to A+ pollsters. The A and the A- pollsters are pretty good. So you'll have a long list of polls that you can actually look at.
So there's obviously a lot of talk and issues with election security. Are there similar issues with online polling and the ability of anyone to sway results?
No, the way that we administer the polls really doesn't allow for that kind of interference. That would be really tough.
Good to know.
Yeah.
I wish it were tougher to influence the election itself. So how much does it cost to run? I'm sure there's a range, and I'm sure there are different types of polls, but can you give us a sort of primer on the cost of polls and different types of polls, and like state versus national and things like that?
Yeah, so the primary cost, the things that determine the cost of a poll are the number of people you interview, so the sample size, the length of the interview, because it costs more to keep someone on the phone for 20 minutes than to keep someone on the phone for 5 minutes. So longer surveys cost more money. If you have an interviewer and they're doing a 20-minute survey, they may only be able to complete 2 in an hour, or maybe just 1.5 in an hour if it's 20 minutes. But if it's 5 minutes, they may be able to complete 6 or 8 in an hour. So the length is also really impacts. Then the mode of administration, whether it's telephone or whether it's online, also really impacts the cost. So, and there's a third. So with online surveys, there's convenience panels, where these are panels that the consumer research industry in this country is huge, the advertising industry and the market research that they need. So they have built these huge panels of millions and millions of consumers across the country who opt into the panels, and they volunteer to take surveys. And most of the surveys they're taking are about, new car design or hot dog flavors or other kinds of things that they're selling, radio shows, or all of that kind of stuff. But political pollsters get the benefit of these heavily developed and invested in by private industry panels. So there's these panels. They are not a random selection of the entire nation, and so pollsters have to be really careful using them and which ones they use. Those are less expensive. There are panels that are online panels that are probability samples, meaning that they really are representative of the nation. And Ipsos has built one, and NORC, the National Opinion Research Center, has built one. There's 3 or 4 different ones around the country. And that is where they call people on the phone to recruit them to be part of the online panel. And they mail them letters, and they do everything they can to make sure that they have a representative sample. And when people don't have internet, or they don't have a computer, they actually mail them one, and they'll set them up with internet to make sure that even people who typically couldn't be included in an online panel are in an online panel. those panels are incredibly expensive to develop, maintain, and build. They have to continually recruit new people for them because they don't want to just have professional poll respondents who are just taking, the same polls over and over. So they have to keep refreshing it. So there are some of those polls online are higher quality, but those are much more expensive. So with all of that, an inexpensive poll could be as little as $25,000 or $30,000, and they can easily go up to $100,000 or more, depending on the combination of these things.
You talked about the length of the poll. Like, does that make the poll itself more accurate? If it's you were saying if it's a 20-minute survey versus a 5-minute survey, like what's going into making your decision about how many questions you're asking each person? Is it more beneficial to ask more because you've got someone on the phone and you're wanting to take advantage of that?
No, the length of the survey is really determined by what you're trying to learn from the survey. So you could do a very short poll where you ask your screening questions, you ask your demographic questions, and then you ask their presidential preference, who they're going to vote for president, who they'll vote for Senate, for Congress. Maybe you'll ask them their top issues that are most important to them in voting, and then you'll get off the phone and the whole thing is 5 to 7 minutes. And all that will do is give you that sort of snapshot about where things are in terms of those races and a little bit on issues. If you want to get deeper and know more, you have to ask more questions. So the broader your learning goals are, if you want to know how people feel about the racial justice protests and how people feel about climate change, and you want to know how people are concerned about the pandemic, and if they're more concerned about economic impacts or health impacts, et cetera, that's going to be a longer survey because you're trying to get a fuller picture of people's attitudes.
So is there an oversight body or some other organization that ensures that people who are publishing polls have done it correctly and are above board in publishing their results?
No, pollsters, it is the wild, wild west. Anybody who wants to be a pollster can be a pollster. That's, it's just, there's no governing agency. You can be a bad pollster, and as long as somebody will hire you and pay you, you're going to continue to be in business. There is a really important organization called APOR, which is the American Association of Public Opinion Researchers, and that is an opt-in organization, a professional organization of researchers, and it's very, very respected and highly regarded, and they have been doing a tremendous amount, and I've been a proud member for many years. They have been doing a tremendous amount to try to increase transparency from pollsters about their methodologies. So they launched a transparency initiative, I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago, and they've asked pollsters to sign on to that, and they have a whole list on their website of which pollsters have signed on to it. And those pollsters have committed to disclose all the methodology that they use on any poll that they make public, so that people can have that information and be able to compare apples and apples in terms of methodology. So APOR has been working very hard, not only to increase transparency and sort of consistency around those standards, but also to educate journalists about how to write about polls and how to write about polling data. Because oftentimes journalists, they'll try to hype a single number that's an outlying poll because they want it to be newsworthy, but it's actually an outlier poll and it's probably not accurate. And so there's some things that the APOR is trying to do to help journalists understand a little bit more, a little better about how to write about surveys and survey results.
We're getting close to running out of time, but I have a couple more questions that I hope we can get through. So the first one is, how has the current climate around fake news and sort of the polarization of the country affected, or have you noticed any effect on how people are viewing polls and how useful polls might be?
So I'm trying to think about that. So there's always been a lot of misinformation in America. And there's always been a lot of things that people just believe, and maybe there's not much factual basis for it. I can't remember the percentage of people that think that UFOs are real, but it's pretty high in the United States. Maybe they are, but so there's a way in which sort of polls continue to capture attitudes that people hold, whether they're accurate or not, and that hasn't changed. I do think, I'm trying to think, I do feel like fake news has had an impact in terms of making people just more skeptical of information and more trusting of certain sources, and certainly with pollsters. So, you know, if you're a conservative Republican, you really trust Fox News when they say that they have a poll, and look at their poll results more than you're going to trust other sources of information. So it may have a bigger impact on which polls people find to be credible than it has on the polling itself.
So final question is broad, and it's basically, what polling projects are you working on now? And can you share that with us?
Just generally speaking, so we do work on, in particular, our particular area of expertise is on socially controversial and emotionally complex topics. So we do a lot of work around immigration in the US, around abortion and abortion access, around climate and environmental protections and other kinds of things like that, that people don't have simple feelings about. They have complicated feelings. And our focus is on understanding all of the different factors that combine together to help people get to where they are. And then we deconstruct that so we can try to understand how we can help people change. Kind of, we talk about it as accelerating social change. So we like to think that our work is contributing to making the world a better place. It feels very important right now. And so we do, a lot of our work is focused on like deep long-term social change projects.
That's great. Thank you. So I want to be respectful of people's time. I think we got through all of the questions, I hope. They come kind of fast and furious. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you to Amy Simon for taking the time to be with us. And I also wanted to thank Jennifer and Julie and the rest of our program committee, as always, for putting together our programs. So feel free, the live stream on YouTube will stay on YouTube, and you can share that with friends, family, anyone who is not able to attend today. And again, consider subscribing to our YouTube channel and checking out lwvpiedmont.org if you're interested in joining our League of Women Voters mailing list or becoming a member. And that officially ends our program tonight. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us.